In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The men who had led the country into the most destructive war in its history faced tribunals, imprisonment, and in some cases, execution. Their names were written into history, tried, sentenced, remembered. But the women standing just behind them, their stories were almost never written down at all. Some vanished into silence, some were erased by their own families, and at least one fought back against a world that expected her to disappear quietly. This is the story of what happened to them. When the Allied occupation of Japan began in September 1945, the country was unrecognizable. Entire cities had been reduced to ash. Millions of people were displaced, hungry, and without direction. In the middle of this collapse, the wives and families of Japan's wartime leaders faced something that most Japanese civilians did not: the very public destruction of everything their lives had been built around. Japan in 1945 was not simply a defeated country. It was a country mid-transformation. General Douglas MacArthur, heading the Allied Occupation Authority, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, oversaw a sweeping restructuring of Japanese society. Democratic institutions replaced imperial structures, land reform was enforced, war crimes trials were announced, and the men who had directed Japan's military campaigns were designated for investigation. For their wives, none of this was abstract. These were women who had spent the war years playing their assigned roles with precision, hosting officials, maintaining household reputations, raising children within the strict expectations of imperial Japanese society. They had accepted the rules of a system that expected their absolute loyalty to their husbands' careers and to the empire itself. Now, the empire was gone. Their husbands were either dead, imprisoned, in hiding, or standing before international tribunals. And the women who had shaped their domestic lives around all of that were left to navigate a world that had no formal place for them at all. The occupation authorities focused their attention on the men. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, began its proceedings in May 1946, with 28 senior military and political figures standing accused. The trial ran until November 1948. Throughout those years, the wives of the accused were neither witnesses nor defendants. They occupied an almost invisible position, close enough to understand everything, distant enough to be overlooked by history. Some of these women had resources. The wives of senior politicians often came from established families and could, in some cases, rely on those family networks for shelter and support. But social standing in post-war Japan was not necessarily protection. The names of these women's husbands were now synonymous with defeat, atrocity, and national disgrace. That carried consequences far beyond the walls of any courtroom. The Japanese public's relationship with its wartime leadership was complicated and often contradictory. Some saw these leaders as having sacrificed everything for the nation. Others held deep resentment. For the women attached to those names, there was rarely a comfortable middle ground. Either they were treated with hushed respect by those who remained loyal to the old order, or they were associated with the very men who had led Japan into catastrophe. Navigating that divide, in neighborhoods, in conversations with former acquaintances, in the daily business of keeping a household running under occupation, was a reality that no historical record has adequately captured. For families whose assets were frozen or confiscated, the practical difficulties of survival compounded everything else. Before their individual stories can be followed, it helps to understand something about the world they had come from. The expectations placed on these women before 1945 shaped what the collapse of those expectations actually cost them. The wives of Japan's wartime leaders were not a uniform group. They came from different backgrounds, held different temperaments, and had different relationships with the public roles their husbands occupied. What they shared was a common set of social expectations that governed almost every aspect of their visible lives. Imperial Japanese society placed women in a firmly defined position within the household. The concept of Ryosai Kenbo, good wife, wise mother, was not merely cultural shorthand. It was official doctrine, promoted by the state and taught in schools. Women of the elite class were expected to manage the household with efficiency and discretion, raise children who would serve the nation, and present themselves as composed extensions of their husband's dignity. Independent civic roles were not part of the arrangement. For the wives of men at the highest levels of government and military command, this meant something specific. They were expected to be impeccably presented at official functions, to maintain relationships with other elite families, and to manage households that were extensions of state institutions. Places where official business was conducted informally, where visiting dignitaries were received, and where the reputation of the man of the house was always on display. Katsuko Tojo, the wife of Prime Minister and General Hideki Tojo, embodied this role with particular consistency. Hideki Tojo had been the most powerful man in Japan during the war years, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister, Army Minister, and later as Chief of the Army General Staff. He was the dominant figure in Japan's decision to proceed with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Katsuko had been his wife since 1909. By the time the war ended, she had spent more than 3 decades as the wife of a man whose career had moved from junior officer to the apex of Japanese political and military power. There was also Itsu Hirota, the wife of former Prime Minister Koki Hirota, a career diplomat who had served as Prime Minister from 1936 to 1937, and as Foreign Minister at several points during the war years. Hirota was a quieter, more cerebral figure than Tojo, shaped by diplomacy rather than by the military, but his proximity to decisions made at the highest levels of government would place him firmly in the jurisdiction of the post-war tribunals. And there was Masako Matsui, the wife of General Iwane Matsui, the commander of Japanese forces during the capture of Nanjing in December 1937, an event that would become one of the most closely scrutinized episodes of the entire war crimes proceedings. These women had navigated the specific pressures of wartime Japan with varying degrees of visibility. Some had virtually no public profile at all. Others were recognized figures in elite social circles, but all of them had organized their lives around the careers and positions of their husbands. When those careers ended in the way they did, the disruption was total. The war itself had already taken a toll before the surrender. Japan's cities had been under sustained aerial bombardment since early 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night and left large portions of the city destroyed. Many elite households had been evacuated or relocated. Children had been sent to the countryside. By the time the surrender came in August 1945, the daily lives of these women had already been upended by the war's closing violence. What came next would test them in ways that the war itself, as devastating as it had been, had not prepared them for. The most documented of those stories belongs to a woman who was present for something that almost no one outside Japan has ever fully heard about. Of all the women connected to Japan's wartime leadership, Katsuko Tojo's experience after 1945 may be the most documented, partly because her husband became the most prominent defendant at the Tokyo trials, and partly because Katsuko herself refused to accept the role of silent widow without a fight. Hideki Tojo was arrested by American military police on September 11, 1945, days after the formal surrender ceremony. When soldiers arrived at his Tokyo home to take him into custody, he attempted to end his own life with a pistol shot to the chest. The wound was serious, but not fatal. He was stabilized and transferred to Sugamo prison to await trial. Katsuko was present at the family home when this happened. She had spent the final weeks of the war watching her husband navigate the humiliation of defeat, the surrender, and the rapid dissolution of everything he had built his life around. When the soldiers came and the chaos of that morning unfolded, she was left in a house that had gone from the center of Japanese military and political power to an ordinary building in a defeated city. The social consequences for the Tojo family were immediate and severe. Neighbors distanced themselves. Former associates stopped visiting. The family name, which had carried enormous weight during the war, now carried a different kind of weight. The weight of association with the men held responsible for Japan's catastrophe. Katsuko did not withdraw. She visited her husband regularly at Sugamo prison throughout the trial, which lasted more than 2 years. She maintained consistently and openly that he had acted out of duty to the emperor and to Japan, and that she did not regard him as a criminal in the way the tribunal defined the term. Katsuko followed the proceedings as best she could from the outside, managing a household stripped of its former standing, while maintaining contact with a husband who was, by every indication, aware of how the trial would end. Hideki Tojo was found guilty on all major counts by the Tokyo Tribunal in November 1948, and was executed by hanging at Sugamo Prison on December 23, 1948, along with 6 other convicted Class A war criminals, including Generals Kenji Doihara, Heitaro Kimura, and Seishiro Itagaki, as well as former Prime Minister Koki Hirota. After her husband's execution, Katsuko Tojo lived for several more decades. She did not retreat entirely from public life. She spoke about her husband's legacy in interviews over the years and maintained until her death that he had been a loyal servant of Japan rather than the architect of criminal policy. She died in 1982. Her consistency, and the fact that she continued to speak openly, made her one of the more visible figures among the wives of the executed men. But Katsuko's story, as difficult as it was, unfolded in a context of relative public attention. The story of Itsu Hirota unfolded in something closer to tragedy, and it begins with the most disputed verdict the Tokyo Tribunal ever handed down. Of all the verdicts handed down by the Tokyo Tribunal, the one that generated the most controversy among legal observers, both at the time and in subsequent decades, was the death sentence imposed on Koki Hirota. Hirota was not a military man. He was a diplomat, a former prime minister, and a foreign minister. His defenders argued that he had, in several instances, actively attempted to moderate the behavior of Japan's military leadership, and that his proximity to decisions that led to atrocities was not the same as directing or ordering those atrocities. The prosecution argued that he had been in positions of authority and had failed to prevent what was preventable. The tribunal found him guilty and sentenced him to death. He was the only civilian among the 7 men executed on December 23, 1948. Even one of the 11 presiding judges, the Indian jurist Radha Binod Pal, filed a lengthy dissent arguing that the entire tribunal structure was legally flawed and that several of the convictions, including Hirota's, were not supported by the evidence presented. For Itsu Hirota, the execution of her husband came at the end of more than 2 years of trial proceedings that she had followed from a distance, with no formal role in the process and no real ability to influence its outcome. She had married Koki Hirota in 1916, and their marriage had endured the full arc of his career, from junior diplomat to foreign minister to prime minister to prisoner. What made Itsu's situation particularly stark was the family's financial position after the war. Koki Hirota had dedicated his entire career to government service, and that service carried, for families of the convicted, no pension, no support structure, and no formal acknowledgement. Itsu Hirota lived in reduced circumstances after her husband's death. The family did not speak openly to the press. What documentation exists suggests a woman who chose privacy over public advocacy, in sharp contrast to Katsuko Tojo's continued visibility. She died without the kind of public record that would make her post-war experience fully traceable. The contrast between the 2 women is itself telling. Both had been wives of men found guilty and executed by the same tribunal on the same night. But their responses, and the way history recorded them, could not have been more different. Katsuko Tojo spoke. Itsu Hirota did not. And history, which tends to record what is said rather than what is endured in silence, preserved one story far more completely than the other. That weight was not unique to Itsu Hirota. Among the widows of the executed, it took different forms depending on what the husband's name was attached to. For Masako Matsui, it was attached to Nanjing. General Iwane Matsui commanded the Central China Area Army during the fall of Nanjing in December 1937. What followed the capture of the city, a prolonged period of mass killing and destruction carried out by Japanese troops, became one of the defining atrocity cases of the Pacific War. Estimates of the death toll during what became known as the Nanjing Massacre vary considerably across historical sources, with figures ranging from tens of thousands to over 200,000 civilian and prisoner deaths across a 6-week period. Matsui himself was not present in Nanjing for the full duration of the violence. He had entered the city at the head of Japanese forces and had, by some accounts documented at trial, expressed concern about the behavior of troops under his overall command. He issued orders that were either ignored or only partially followed. But the tribunal held that his command responsibility meant he bore accountability for what occurred, regardless of whether he had personally directed specific acts. He was found guilty and executed alongside Tojo and Hirota on December 23, 1948. To understand what his conviction meant for Masako Matsui, it helps to understand something of who Iwane Matsui actually was. Because he was not a simple figure, and that complexity must have made her situation harder rather than easier. Matsui was 60 years old when he was arrested in 1945. He had served in the Imperial Japanese Army for decades and had spent years in China long before the war. Not as an adversary, but as what he apparently regarded as a student of Chinese culture. He had been a founding member of the Greater Asia Association, which promoted Pan-Asian solidarity against Western colonial power, and had spent years arguing within military circles for a Japan-China relationship built on cooperation rather than conquest. And then, in December 1937, the troops under his command carried out one of the worst documented atrocities of the 20th century in a city he had captured. This contradiction between the man who claimed to love China and the commander who presided over Nanjing was something Matsui spent his remaining years trying to reconcile. At Sugamo prison, he devoted himself to Buddhist practice. Before his arrest, he had arranged the construction of Koa Kannon, a small shrine in Atami, Shizuoka Prefecture, intended as a memorial to all who had died in the conflict on both sides. The ashes of several executed war criminals, including Matsui himself, were eventually enshrined there. The site still exists. Masako Matsui had been his wife since 1912. Their marriage stretched across his entire rise through the military, from the campaigns of the early 20th century, through his command of the Shanghai Expeditionary Army in 1937 and the events that followed. She had lived in Japan throughout those years, managing the household in his absence, which, for a career military officer, meant managing it alone for extended periods across decades. What the Tokyo trial placed on Masako was not just widowhood. It was a permanent association with Nanjing, a name that grew more politically charged with every passing decade. In some quarters, Matsui was regarded as a war criminal in the clearest sense. In others, he was seen as a soldier unfairly blamed for the actions of men who had not answered directly to him. Masako lived in that contested landscape without a voice in any of it. There is no documented account of her own understanding of what her husband had or had not done. No interview, no memoir, no letter that entered the public record. What she did have, in common with the other widows, was the shrine at Atami, a place of mourning her husband had built before his death, and that outlasted him by decades. Whether it gave her comfort or simply stood as a monument to the unresolved contradictions of the man she had married, no one recorded. The widows of the executed men carry the most visible weight in this story, but they were not the only women shaped by the trials. For those whose husbands were convicted and imprisoned rather than executed, the post-war experience was different in character, and in some ways harder to navigate, because it lasted longer. Not all of the 28 defendants at the Tokyo tribunal were sentenced to death. Of the remaining convicted men, 7 received life imprisonment and others received shorter terms. Those serving life sentences included former Prime Minister Kiichiro Hiranuma, former Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and former Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso. For the wives of these men, the post-war experience was different in character from that of the widows, but no less demanding in its own way. Shigenori Togo had served as Japan's foreign minister at 2 critical junctures, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack in late 1941, and again in 1945, when he had reportedly argued within the government for a negotiated end to the war. His documented positions in 1945 were oriented toward ending the conflict, yet he was convicted and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, making him one of the most debated defendants in the entire proceedings. His wife, Edith de Lalande Togo, was unlike anyone else in this story. She was German by birth, the daughter of a German father and a Japanese mother, and had grown up moving between 2 cultures in a way that was rare, even among diplomatic circles. She met Shigenori Togo when he was posted to the Japanese embassy in Berlin in the early 1920s, and they married in 1921. It was, by the standards of the time, a remarkable union. A Japanese diplomat and a woman of German-Japanese heritage, building a life that would take them across multiple continents before finally settling in Japan. By the time Japan entered the war in December 1941, Edith had spent 2 decades navigating the challenges of her position. She was not fully accepted as Japanese by many in the country's elite social circles, and the war's political logic made her European identity a complication rather than a credential. Germany's defeat in May 1945 preceded Japan's by 3 months. By August, she was a woman whose birth country and adopted country had both lost the same war on different fronts. When Shigenori Togo was arrested and charged, Edith's position became stranger still. She was the wife of a Japanese war criminal being tried by an Allied tribunal, living in a country under American occupation, a European national by birth, in an era when none of those identities offered any particular protection or standing. What Edith did in practical terms was persist. She maintained contact with her husband throughout his imprisonment. She actively pursued avenues toward a review of his case, corresponding with individuals connected to the legal process. Shigenori Togo's account of his wartime role, later published as The Cause of Japan, was written during his years at Sugamo, and Edith's efforts to support that record were a consistent part of his imprisonment. Shigenori Togo died in Sugamo prison on July 23, 1950, before completing his sentence. His health had deteriorated significantly, and he was 66 years old at the time of his death. Edith had spent nearly 5 years working toward his release, and he died before it came. She remained in Japan after his death. She did not return to Germany. Japan was where her children and grandchildren were, and where whatever remained of the life she and Shigenori had built together could still be found. Their granddaughter, Kazuko Oka, later entered the Japanese Foreign Service and became a diplomat, one of the very few cases in post-war Japan where a direct descendant of a convicted war criminal built a recognized career in government service. That trajectory from Sugamo prison to the foreign ministry in the span of a single generation is one of the more quietly remarkable outcomes in this entire story. Kuniaki Koiso had served as prime minister from July 1944 to April 1945, inheriting a war already effectively lost. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, dying in Sugamo prison in 1950. His wife's experience followed the pattern common to most of these women: reduced circumstances, removal from public life, and permanent association with a name that Japanese society had moved on from. The occupation formally ended in 1952 under the San Francisco Peace Treaty. The Japanese government subsequently began releasing those still held at Sugamo, and legislation gradually restored certain civic rights to the convicted. All surviving Sugamo prisoners were released by 1958. For the women who had spent years managing households in the shadow of their husbands' imprisonment, no legislative act could restore what those years had cost them. By the late 1950s, the formal machinery of the occupation and its trials had wound down. What remained was the longer, quieter question of how Japan, and the families at the center of this story, would carry what had happened. By the mid-1950s, Japan was moving quickly through an extraordinary transformation. The economy was recovering and would soon begin the period of sustained growth that would define the following 2 decades. The wounds of the war were being managed in ways that often involved deliberate silence rather than sustained public engagement. For the wives and families of Japan's wartime leaders, this broader social silence was both a relief and a burden. A relief because it reduced the direct scrutiny they had faced in the years immediately after the surrender. A burden because it meant that no one was particularly interested in their experiences, their accounts, or their welfare. Several of these women lived well into the post-war decades. Katsuko Tojo died in 1982, spending those years occasionally referenced in biographical studies of their husbands, but rarely the subject of direct historical attention in their own right. A small number of the next generation eventually addressed their family histories directly in public life. Yuko Tojo, one of Hideki Tojo's daughters-in-law, and a later member of the Japanese House of Representatives, became publicly associated with efforts to rehabilitate her father-in-law's historical reputation. Seen by many as a refusal to accept established historical record, and by others as a legitimate act of family loyalty within democratic discourse. That these debates were still being fought decades after the executions is itself a measure of something. In 1978, 14 men charged in connection with Class A war crimes, including Tojo, Hirota, and Matsui, were quietly enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, designated as martyrs rather than criminals. The enshrinement, done in secret and only reported by the press the following year, transformed private grief into a permanent public argument. The families of those men became, whether they sought it or not, participants in a dispute about history that has not been resolved. The women themselves are largely absent from Japan's public commemorative landscape. There are no monuments to them. There are very few dedicated historical studies. The effect of that absence is that a significant dimension of what the end of the war actually meant, lived day by day, in specific households by specific people, remains largely unwritten. They navigated the post-war period with the same qualities that had defined their lives before 1945: discipline, family loyalty, and an acceptance of limited choices within a rapidly changing society. They lived the rest of their lives in the space left to them by history, which is to say, in a space smaller than most of them deserved. The year 1945 did not end their stories. It simply made those stories harder to find. The wives of Japan's wartime leaders did not choose the circumstances that defined their post-war lives. They had been shaped by a system that gave them almost no independent public role, and when that system collapsed, they were left without the formal standing that might have made their experiences easier to document or easier to support. Some found ways to remain present, to speak, to advocate, as Katsuko Tojo did across the decades after her husband's execution. Others endured in silence, as Itsu Hirota and Masako Matsui appear to have done, their inner lives never fully accessible to those who came after them. Some navigated the particular complexity of being the wives of men whose culpability was legally contested, and whose legacies remained sources of unresolved tension in Japanese public memory for generations. What they shared, across the differences in their husbands' roles, their family circumstances, and their individual choices, was the experience of living through one of the most complete social collapses in modern history, from within households that had been at the center of the system that collapsed. They had built their lives within the structures available to them, and when those structures fell, they were left to manage the aftermath with almost no formal support and almost no public recognition. History has not served them particularly well. That too is part of the record. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.